The clock on the wall reads 3:14 a.m. The numbers glow in the dark, steady and unblinking. Zyro sits slumped in his chair, the only point of movement in the room. His face is bathed in the harsh, rhythmic pulse of the monitor, a constant wash of neon blue that flickers against the walls. Lines of code cascade down the screen like a waterfall of light, moving at a speed that would blur to anyone else. Zyro does not blink. He leans forward, his pupils tracking the rapid syntax as it refreshes, scrolls, and resets. The room is heavy with the smell of ozone and the low, steady drone of cooling fans. He shifts his weight, the chair creaking in the silence, but his eyes never leave the display. Every line of logic is a thread he is pulling, a sequence he is trying to master. His hand rests near the mechanical keyboard, fingers twitching in time with the scrolling text. He is locked into the machine, his breathing shallow and synced to the rapid-fire updates on the screen. The blue light reflects deep in his eyes, turning his vision into a mirror of the digital stream. The rhythm of the code was absolute. Then, it fractured. A jagged line of static tore through the center of the display, a violent rip in the seamless waterfall of blue. The text did not just stop, it hemorrhaged. Characters scrambled, twisting into unrecognizable symbols that bled across the glass. The neon glow turned a sickly, flickering violet, pulsing in a pattern that made the air in the room feel thin. Zyro watched the screen stutter, the smooth scroll replaced by a violent, jarring skip. A secondary line of white noise erupted from the corner of the monitor, consuming the logic he had been tracking for hours. The screen flickered again, a strobe-like effect that cast long, distorted shadows against the back wall. Every line of syntax began to vibrate, blurring into a single, cohesive smear of light. The clean, clinical precision of the interface was gone, replaced by a chaotic, twitching mess of data. Zyro leaned back, his chair scraping hard against the floorboards. The monitor emitted a sharp, popping sound, like a fuse blowing under pressure. A single, horizontal band of dead pixels crawled slowly upward, erasing the code as it passed. The light from the screen no longer illuminated the room with purpose. It cast a frantic, dying glow. The room plunged into a suffocating stillness. The chaotic flicker of the monitor dimmed, leaving behind a low, rhythmic thrumming. Zyro remained locked in his chair, his body rigid, his breath caught in his throat. A new sound began to climb, a sharp, high-pitched whine. It was the sound of a capacitor struggling to hold its charge, a thin, metallic screech that vibrated against his teeth. He did not move. His hand hovered inches above the mechanical keyboard, fingers splayed and trembling, yet unable to descend. The air grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on his arms stand upright. He watched the screen. The whine intensified, shifting from a background noise to a physical pressure that pushed against his eardrums. He tried to blink, but his eyes were fixed, locked onto the center of the monitor where a single glowing point of light refused to fade. He was a statue in the dark, waiting for the system to break, trapped in the agonizing second before the final collapse. The high-pitched whine snapped into a deafening, silent roar. Without warning, the monitor erupted. A blinding, pure white flash tore through the room, obliterating the shadows and turning the walls into translucent planes of light. It was not a simple glow. It was a physical force. The flash acted like a vacuum, sucking the air from the room and pulling at the very fabric of the space. Zyro felt the sudden shift in gravity. The light didn't just strike his eyes. It anchored itself to his skin, a searing magnetic tether that dragged him forward. He lunged backward, his heels digging into the floorboards, but the floor seemed to lose its solidity, turning soft and yielding beneath his weight. The monitor was no longer a screen. It had expanded into a swirling, viscous vortex of raw data, a hungry mouth of light. The light intensified, turning from white to a deep, electric blue that pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. He felt his center of gravity tilt. The room began to dissolve around him, the edges of his vision blurring into static. as the pull became absolute. The pull became a physical weight, dragging Zyro toward the center of the vortex. He threw his hands forward, desperate to brace himself against the monitor frame, but the glass had ceased to be solid. His fingertips made contact, and the sensation was not of cold screen, but of plunging into freezing, rushing water. A sharp, crystalline sound echoed through the room, like 1,000 mirrors breaking at once. Zyro watched in paralyzed silence as his index finger hit the surface. It did not bend. It disintegrated. The skin and bone dissolved into a spray of glowing neon blue pixels that drifted into the swirling vortex. He pulled back, but the suction held him fast. The destruction moved upward, a chain reaction of light consuming his hand. His knuckles fractured into geometric shards, each one pulsing with the same electric rhythm as the monitor. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the hum of the machine. His palm vanished, replaced by a cloud of flickering data points that spiraled into the screen. He stared at the stump of his wrist, where the flesh was rapidly unspooling into streams of code. The process was silent, clinical, and absolute. The resistance vanished. His arm was the first to go, pulled taut until the muscle and bone felt like thin, elastic threads. He watched his own limbs stretch, elongated and distorted, as if his very atoms were being unspooled by an invisible, humming force. Gravity lost its meaning. He was no longer falling forward. He was being fed into the machine. His torso followed, bending unnaturally as the vortex gripped him, pulling him into the cold, vibrating center of the screen. He felt the sensation of being compressed, his entire mass thinning into a stream of raw, glowing information. The air of the room was gone, replaced by a biting, metallic chill that tasted of ozone and static. The physical world, the desk, the chair, the dim light of the room receded into a tiny, distant pinprick of reality. With a final, violent jerk, the last of his physical presence was ripped from the room. He vanished into the humming, infinite void. The sensation of falling ended with a jarring, flat impact. Zyro hit a surface that felt like solid light, rigid and cool beneath his palms. He pushed himself up, his breath hitching as he scanned the horizon. There was no sky, only a vast, glowing grid that stretched into an infinite, featureless distance. The lines beneath him pulsed with a faint, rhythmic white luminescence, tracing a geometry that defied human perspective. He stood, his balance precarious on the glowing floor. Above him, massive geometric cubes drifted in a sea of dark, electric purple. They moved with a slow, deliberate weight, rotating in place as if governed by a hidden, celestial clockwork. The sheer scale of the architecture pressed down on him. He turned in a slow circle, his boots making no sound against the light. Every direction looked identical, a repeating pattern of infinite lines and shifting shadows. He reached out to touch a passing cube, but his fingers passed through the edge, meeting only a resistance like thick, static charged air. He stood alone in the center of the void, a single, fragile point of consciousness in a landscape that felt entirely indifferent to his existence. The horizon flickered. The absolute silence of the void broke. It started as a low, rhythmic thrumming, a deep frequency pulse that traveled through the soles of his boots. The grid beneath him began to oscillate in time with the vibration, the white lines flickering with a sudden, sharp intensity. Zyro crouched, pressing his palms flat against the glowing surface to steady himself. The floor was no longer rigid. It rippled like water disturbed by a heavy weight. Above, the sea of electric purple began to churn. Thin, jagged streams of neon code detached themselves from the horizon, drifting upward like smoke caught in a draft. They moved with purpose, swirling into a dense, tangled knot directly overhead. The air grew thick, charged with a static pressure that made the hair on his arms stand upright. He looked up, watching as the streams of data began to weave and tighten, knitting together into a singular, massive shape. The thrumming grew louder, escalating from a vibration into a sound that rattled his teeth. The grid lines beneath his feet groaned, a high-pitched metallic screech echoing across the infinite space. He was no longer the only thing moving in this world. The environment itself was responding to a presence, folding and shifting to accommodate something vast. He stood, his gaze locked on the coalescing mass above, waiting for the form to finalize. The swirling chaos of code snapped into a rigid geometric finality. The streams stopped their erratic dance, locking into place to form a towering, monolithic pillar that stretched upward until it vanished into the dark purple haze. It was not merely a shape, but a void of absolute density. The structure possessed a surface of matte, light-absorbing black, contrasting sharply against the glowing grid. As it solidified, the ambient light of the entire space seemed to bend toward it, drawn into its dark mass like water down a drain. Zyro took a step back, but the ground beneath him felt heavy, as if the monolith exerted its own localized gravity. The air grew dense and stagnant, pressing against his chest, with a physical weight that made every breath a conscious effort. He looked up, his neck straining to track the sheer height of the entity. It loomed over him, a silent, unmoving sentinel. The silence returned, but it was the heavy, suffocating silence of something immense waiting to act. The monolith did not remain a static pillar. Its matte black surface began to ripple, the rigid geometry softening as if the structure were made of thick, viscous oil. Zyro watched the surface churn, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The silence of the space was broken by a low, grinding sound, like tectonic plates shifting deep underground. Then, 2 points of light sparked, deep within the dark mass. They were not soft or ambient. They were sharp, piercing, and intensely crimson. The eyes ignited with a sudden, violent flicker, casting long, jagged shadows across the glowing grid floor. They did not blink. They locked onto Zyro with a focus that felt like a physical weight pressing against his skin. The surrounding code streams began to orbit the eyes, drawn into a vortex of motion. The entity was no longer a silent sentinel. It was a hunter. The red light intensified, washing out the electric purple of the horizon and turning the grid lines beneath his feet a harsh, warning scarlet. Zyro stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the burning points of light. The predatory precision of the stare left no room for doubt. The entity had recognized him. The atmosphere in the void shifted from oppressive to lethal. The floor beneath Zyro gave a sharp metallic crack. It sounded like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. He looked down, his pulse hammering in his throat, and watched as a hairline fracture raced across the glowing grid. The line turned from steady blue to a jagged, flickering white. He took a half step back, but the ground beneath his heel gave way entirely, dropping into a bottomless, dark void. The grid lines began to pop and splinter in rapid succession, a chain reaction of structural failure that tore through the floor like a lightning strike. He did not wait to see the rest of the platform vanish. He pushed off the remaining solid section, his muscles coiled and ready, and broke into a full-out sprint. The grid beneath him shuddered with every footfall, the light dying out in patches as the surface dissolved into nothingness. He kept his eyes locked on the horizon, ignoring the roar of static rising from the abyss behind him. The ground was no longer a path. It was a crumbling sequence of segments that vanished the moment he left them. He drove his legs harder, lungs burning. The path ahead terminated abruptly. A jagged, widening chasm split the grid, its depths swirling with raw, unrendered data. Zyro did not slow down. He hit the edge of the final platform, his boots digging into the glowing lines, but the surface was brittle. It shattered under his weight, the light flaking away like dry paint. He felt the ground vanish beneath his lead foot. He lunged forward, throwing his entire weight into the air. For a heartbeat, he was suspended over the abyss, the cold hum of the system vibrating through his chest. He reached out, fingers clawing at the empty space, eyes fixed on the opposite ledge. It was further away than he had calculated. His boots struck the far edge at an awkward angle, skidding on the slick, unstable geometry. He slammed his chest against the hard surface, his grip slipping as the edge began to disintegrate under his palms. He scrambled, digging his fingers into the grid, dragging his body forward. As the platform behind him dissolved into nothingness, he rolled onto his back, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound arrived before the sight. A low-frequency roar, like 1,000 static-filled channels screaming at once. Zyro did not look back. He felt the air pressure shift, a vacuum forming behind him as the entity tore through the digital architecture. The grid lines he had been running on were no longer fracturing. They were being erased. Behind him, the electric purple sky and the geometric cubes were swallowed by a wall of blinding, static-filled white noise. It moved with unnatural speed, a tide of raw, unformatted data devouring the world. Zyro drove his heels into the grid, his lungs burning with every jagged breath. His legs felt heavy, the muscles twitching under the strain of constant, high-speed impact. He sprinted, his boots barely touching the surface before he propelled himself forward again. The noise grew louder, a physical weight pressing against his back, vibrating through his very marrow. He could feel the heat of the entity, a cold, synthetic radiation that made his skin crawl. The platform beneath him narrowed to a single, flickering line of light. He pushed his pace, his stride lengthening, his focus narrowed to the singular point of survival. The white noise surged, licking at his heels, erasing the ground just inches behind his trailing foot. He kept his head down, eyes locked on the path ahead, his entire existence compressed into the rhythm of his own desperate, pounding heart. The grid beneath his boots vanished entirely. Zyro was running on nothing but momentum, his feet striking air, his body lurching forward into the void. Then, the space ahead tore open. It was not a door, but a jagged rip in the fabric of the digital sky. A blinding, pure white aperture pulsed in the center of the static, casting long, sharp shadows across the disintegrating landscape. He skidded to a halt, his boots carving deep grooves into the last remaining fragment of the platform. The white noise roared, a wall of static-filled erasure surging toward him, consuming the final remnants of the grid. He stood at the precipice, the aperture vibrating with a low, rhythmic thrum that resonated in his teeth. The light was intense, bleaching the color from his vision. Behind him, the entity's red eyes flickered within the approaching wall of noise, its form fraying into raw, unformatted code. Zyro braced his legs, his muscles locked in a state of rigid tension. He leaned his weight into the light, his body angled toward the blinding, silent exit. Zyro hung in the empty space, his body tilted toward the blinding white aperture. The air around him turned frigid, a sharp, biting cold that crystallized the remaining digital dust into jagged shards. He felt the system dying, the hum of the virtual world dropping into a low, dying groan. Then, the aperture pulsed. A wave of intense, dry heat washed over him, clashing violently with the freezing air. He extended his right arm, his muscles straining against the vacuum. His hand shook, the fingers splayed wide. The warmth was tangible, a solid pressure that pushed back against his palm. He could feel the texture of the light. Behind him, the roar of the static reached a crescendo. He focused entirely on the aperture, his fingertips brushing the glowing edge. The light flared, wrapping around his hand, pulling at his skin. He leaned forward, the last of the cold system falling away. The boundary shattered. As Zyro crossed the threshold, the warmth he felt vanished, replaced by a sudden, absolute vacuum. The aperture did not just let him through, it consumed him. He felt his physical form stretch, pulled thin across an infinite distance, his nerves firing in a chaotic, rhythmic sequence. Then, the sound arrived. It began as a low-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth, then surged into a deafening, high-pitched scream of static. It was the sound of 1 billion lines of code collapsing simultaneously. The white light intensified, turning from a soft glow into a solid, blinding wall that erased the horizon, the grid, and the entity behind him. He felt the weight of the digital world pressing in from every direction, a crushing pressure that threatened to turn him into raw data. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the light burned through his lids, painting his vision in jagged, pulsing white. The static roared, a physical gale that tore at his skin and whipped through his hair, carrying the scent of ozone and burnt silicon. Then, the world simply ceased to exist. The silence was the first thing he felt. It was heavy, pressing against his ears like deep water. Zyro jolted upright, his back slamming into the wooden headboard with a dull thud. He gasped, his lungs pulling in air that tasted of dust and stale bedroom oxygen, not ozone. His hands flew up, clutching at the sheets, his knuckles white as he anchored himself to the mattress. He was in his room. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint, gray outline of the window frame. He leaned forward, his chest heaving, the rhythm of his own heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pressed his palms against his thighs, feeling the rough texture of the fabric, confirming the reality of his own skin. He wiped a layer of cold sweat from his forehead, his fingers trembling as they traced the line of his brow. He sat frozen, his eyes wide, straining to see through the gloom. Every muscle in his body remained coiled, braced for a sudden shift that did not come. Zyro swung his legs over the side of the bed. His feet hit the floorboards, the wood cold and unyielding beneath his soles. He stood, his knees locking, and moved toward the doorway. Each step felt heavy, as if the air in the hallway had thickened. He navigated by memory, his hand trailing along the wall until his fingers brushed the rough plaster of the bathroom frame. He stepped inside and reached for the light switch, but his hand stopped midair. He did not want to see the room yet. Instead, he found the faucet by touch and twisted the handle. The water sputtered, then flowed, cool and steady. He cupped his hands, catching the stream, and splashed it onto his face. The shock of the temperature hit him, sharp and biting. He gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, his knuckles straining as he pressed his weight down, feeling the solid, unmoving surface beneath his palms. He leaned his head forward, his breath hitching in the small, confined space. He needed to see himself. He needed to confirm that the person looking back was still human, still whole, and still anchored to this world. He lifted his gaze, eyes squinting against the dim light, and locked his stare onto the glass reflection directly in front of him. He stared into his own eyes, searching for the familiar depth of his own gaze. The reflection seemed steady. He blinked, waiting for the lingering fear to subside. Then, the world skipped. His irises did not reflect the bathroom tiles or the dim light of the mirror. Instead, they pulsed with a sharp neon blue flicker. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. A thin, jagged line of syntax scrolled rapidly across his pupil, moving with the same mechanical precision as the code on his monitor. He tried to look away, but his eyes were locked to the movement. The text flowed downward, weaving through the iris, turning his vision into a scrolling terminal. He gripped the sink, his fingers sliding against the cold porcelain. The silence of the room was shattered by a faint, rhythmic hum emanating from deep within his own skull. He was not looking at a reflection. He was looking at a system interface. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had not escaped. He was still there.